in Slovenia, which is now on the cutting edge of the austerity program cutting through all of Europe. It's the latest on the chopping block. On the plane here, I realized that the talk I had written for today is very different from what I'm going to speak about. I'm going to talk about primitive accumulation from the standpoint of what economists have never understood about primitive accumulation. So I start with Adam Smith. Adam Smith is a very interesting example who studiously avoided anything dealing with problems in capitalism. His most famous description is of a very small pin factory that all of you have heard about. What you might not realize is that it was a pack of lies, setting a standard that economists have followed scrupulously. First of all, the pin factory was located in Adam Smith's neighborhood, supposedly. What he didn't mention was that the Industrial Revolution began in the little village where he lived. The largest industrial factory in the world was making the cannons that allowed the British Navy to conquer large parts of the world. We never hear about that. In the pin factory, there's a little reference to nail workers, considered orphans, but more likely they were the children of people whose family had been displaced from the land by primitive accumulation. The factory, which made cannons, had excess metal. The nail workers from all around England and Scotland to relocate to Kirkcaldy, Smith's home village. And the company, the Cairn Works, made deals with the orphanages to supply these children who were like slaves working for them. But they were very dexterous. That's all Adam Smith tells us about. Now, interestingly enough, although Adam Smith was a very, very distinguished philosopher, and his book on moral sentiments was very popular, his books on his main book, The Wealth of Nations, was ignored. No one paid attention to it. It came in one of the libraries. By 1789, the copy had been checked out 3 times. But 1789, what happened? French Revolution. And suddenly the importance of Smith was recognized. Here is an answer to all of these people calling for revolution, for equity, or more particularly, for liberty, equality, and fraternity. Francis Horner was perhaps, with the exception of Ricardo, the leading economic thinker in the Parliament. He was asked to do a new edition of The Wealth of Nations. He declined. His reason was, if I were to do a new edition, I would have to point out all of his mistakes. I would not want to do this until the book's work is done. So now the work's done, and nobody still has pointed out all of his mistakes. For example, he tells you in the pin factory, he says, if a worker were to produce pins on his own, he could produce only a few pins a day. But in the pin factory, he can produce many, many, many pins. Except what he didn't say was, first of all, he was plagiarizing all of the data and all the information from an unacknowledged French article. And then he didn't tell you that his figures based on the individual worker was on the assumption that the individual worker had to dig up the ore, smelt the ore, pull it into wires, and then make the pins. So it was almost as if when you go to the supermarket next time, you should applaud the checkout person who's able to feed many, many more people than an individual farmer. Okay, so that's Adam Smith. Now, at the same time, in the same village, there was another economist named Sir James Stewart, smarter, deeper, and unacknowledged. And he was not acknowledged because when he was writing about the market, and he was very conservative. Yes. Sir James Stewart.
S-T-E-U.
And at one point in his book, he made the mistake of saying, you know, in the market, well, first of all, he was talking about how good Sparta was and how it would be good if we could emulate Sparta. But he says, no, we couldn't get slavery anymore. But we can get the same thing from the market. Boom, there goes his book. And later in life, he said, if I were to write a biography of my poor departed dog, it would have been 3 times as long and many times more read. Okay? So here we get the idea of you want to hold things down. At the time, what was going on was the displacement of workers from the land. None of the economists acknowledged it. Smith said, oh, that's a bunch of aristocrats. Nobody else even mentioned it, except James Stewart and a few pamphleteers. And Stewart said, you have to be careful kicking the people off the land. He said, a horse has to be caressed before it is put a bridle on. And he said, you have to be careful to make sure that you have adequate demand for the workers before you kick them off the land, as you have to do this scientifically. And he's much better than Adam Smith. Now, what's interesting is none of the economists talked about primitive accumulation in any of their writings. And yet, these same economists, time and again, in their private papers, in their letters, would applaud it, because they wanted to talk about the market as a system of voluntary relations. Just what Adam Smith was saying.
Voluntary what?
Relationships. Ricardo, David Ricardo, perhaps the smartest economist who ever wrote, argued, for example, that the problem in Ireland was that food was too cheap. And if we're going to get the Irish economy to work the way we want it, we have to make food more difficult to get. The problem with Ireland was underpopulation, because if they had more people, then they'd have more poverty, and then they'd have more wage workers. This is the world that these people lived in. So the economists are supporting this. And now we're seeing another wave of primitive accumulation. Marx even said that public debt is a lever of primitive accumulation. A lever of primitive accumulation. Public debt.
Try to grow your voice a little bit.
When you make your points go up instead of down.
I've never run for public office.
Teach. How do your students use it?
Pardon?
How do your students use it?
I whisper in their ear.
Only intimate seminars.
Okay, public debt is a lever of primitive accumulation. And yeah, tell me if I drift down. Okay, now the difference between modern primitive accumulation and primitive accumulation, classical political accumulation, classical primitive accumulation, is that classical primitive accumulation was occurring at a time of great optimism. There were new opportunities. At first, aristocrats, landowners realized that if they kicked the people off the land, people who had not private property, but they had hereditary rights to the land, they could kick them off the land, they wouldn't have to feed them, they could keep a few of them, they could raise sheep, they could sell the wool in Europe, and make much more surplus than they could if they were to continue doing conventional agriculture. So here was a new opportunity, and primitive accumulation was a way of trying to take advantage of these new opportunities. Today, the opportunities of capitalism are becoming smaller and smaller. We had two great opportunities. One was the opening up of Eastern Europe and then China, and those have not proved as profitable as was expected. And then was the dot-com boom.
The what?
Dot-com boom, the internet boom in the late 1990s. But even so, profits have been under attack. And the attack has gone on since the late 1960s. That is, we had a post-war boom, and the boom occurred for a curious reason. It occurred because of destructiveness. First of all, destructiveness. First of all, the war destroyed many of our competitors, and the Depression destroyed a great deal of excess capital. And during the Depression, what you saw was intense competition that forced the scrapping of many factories, creating a shortage that allowed for greater profitability. We see this today in the airline industry. Airlines are profitable. Why? Where do most of the airlines fly most of their planes? In the desert. By removing the planes from the airports to the desert, they can pack in all of their flights and they can make a great profit. So you had this particular unique period called the Golden Age. Profits go up, everyone's happy, and by the late 1960s, profits are starting to stagnate. And all of a sudden, the US went into a dramatic shift into right-wing activism, funded by huge contributions, beginning with the Coors family. Then you get people like the Koch brothers, and you had a whole network of right-wing activism that was able to turn the economy around to make it possible to create a kind of primitive accumulation, not by taking away private property, but by taking away public property. Right now, the latest form of public property being confiscated is the pension. Pensions are terrible. Governments have overcommitted. Corporations are overcommitted. Have any of you heard of Patriot Coal? Patriot Coal Company. Coal. Patriot Coal was a company created when Peabody Oil split off all of its unprofitable coal mines and then credited Patriot Coal with all of the pension and medical care that the company was supposed to take care of. And just recently, the courts just said, that's okay. You've eliminated, pardon?
They approved.
They approved it. You're seeing pensions being cut everywhere, corporate pensions, government pensions, and the bond market rewards those states that cut their pensions and punishes those that are willing to honor their obligations. At the same time, bondholders' obligations are sacred and nothing can challenge them. Now, part of the problem that capitalism suffered and continues to suffer and has continued to suffer in the United States from the late 1870s is the problem of overcompetition. Overcompetition means that in a modern economy, in the particular kind of overcompetition I want to discuss, in a modern economy, the price of producing one more unit is very small. Whether it's a pharmaceutical pill, whether it's a recorded music, or whether it's a seat in an airplane. That is, it doesn't cost much to carry me from California to New York if there's an empty seat. And what we know from our beginning economics is that prices go down to what's called the marginal cost, the cost of producing one more. And the United States first realized this during the late 19th century when the railroads were coming online. And the railroads were competing with each other. And the prices were going down. And they were going bankrupt. In The Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Scrooge's first nightmare, what was it? He had bought bonds in American railroads. That was so terrible, a nightmare. What had happened? The railroads would compete with each other, they couldn't pay off their bonds, and the railroad represented 2/3 of the capital stock of the United States. The stock market itself was trivial and insignificant until railroad paper started moving. Am I talking too softly again? Okay. Well, you help me, stand up and do something. Okay, so here's the deal with the railroads. Prices would go down to the marginal cost. If they only got the marginal cost, they couldn't pay off the bonds. And the man who represented Scrooge and the other bondholders was a familiar name, J.P. Morgan. Actually, it was his father, Junius Morgan. But J.P. Morgan took over from the father. And he would tell the railroads, you guys are crazy, don't compete. And they would all agree not to compete. And then someone would cheat. The agreement would fall apart, and the railroads would go bankrupt again. Not just the railroads, but all sorts of companies. So Morgan started Morganizing the economy, leading a great consolidation. And the consolidation was one in which Morgan would take over a company, or another financier would take over a company, lump them all together, reduce competition, and could raise prices. He did it with the railroads. He did it with United States Steel. I think the United States Steel, the cost of the takeover was something like 1% of the gross domestic product of the United States. Maybe more. I'm not good with numbers. So what happened was, in the late 1870s, there was this Great Depression. That was the Great Depression, 1870s. Later, there was a new Great Depression. Now we only have a modest recession. But in this Great Depression, it lasted from the 1870s, 1871, until the 1890s. And finally, Teddy Roosevelt got us out of the war. He was only Undersecretary of the Navy, but he got the Spanish-American War started, and that got America booming again and ended the Depression. However, one of the ironies of competition, or of economics is you need competition to create progress, to create innovation, and yet competition is destructive. A depression is nothing else more than a strong competition, a wave of strong competition. So what you got after 1870s and after 1890s, then you got a less vibrant economy until the discovery of electrical motors, and then you got a burst in the 20s and then down again. Capitalism doesn't work. Because it doesn't work, you see the emergence of an almost entirely parasitic capitalist system, looking everywhere, looking for new forms of primitive accumulation, whether in Taksim Square, whether in Slovenia, whether in the United States. Primitive accumulation, primitive accumulation, primitive accumulation. Okay, now you get to hear two speakers who will speak more loudly. First speaker is David McNally from New York University. Listen, I don't have to introduce these people. Everybody knows you and you.
I'm David McNally from York University. I want to thank the Union for Radical Political Economics for sponsoring this forum. And really what I want to do in my remarks is look at the role of ongoing primitive accumulation today in generating the massive growth of a global reserve army of labor, which I argue is crucial to understanding not only the neoliberal era, but the moment, the age of austerity that was introduced with the global slump beginning in 2008. And of course, it's true that primitive accumulation, or various synonyms for it, such as David Harvey's accumulation by dispossession, has been in the air for some time now, and one can see why. We are witnessing an accelerated wave of land grabs, particularly in the global south. Between 2000 and 2010, about 200 million hectares of land have been bought up in developing countries. For instance, that's because some of you will know Canada is a big country geographically. That's about 3 times the arable land that Canada has. 2/3 of these land grabs are in Africa. So we're seeing this accelerated process of seizing land in one form or another. And this can sometimes be for water, it can be for ecotourism, it can be for mineral and oil and gas exploration, it can be for industrial development, as much of it is in India and China, for instance. It can be the capitalization on so-called natural disasters, as happened in Honduras after Hurricane Mitch in 1998, or of course, as many of you know, happened in Louisiana after Katrina. And of course, it can also involve civil wars, where we often think of civil wars as being primarily ethnic conflicts. Many commentators in recent years have pointed out that the so-called ethnic conflicts are more often than not covers for displacement. They are the ethnicization, in other words, of attempts to displace people. So that, as one economist in Colombia has put it, talking about the so-called wars in Colombia, there is war so there might be displacement. There is not displacement because there is war. In other words, war, militarized violence as an instrument of displacement. And all of this resonates powerfully with Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation in Part 8 of Volume 1 of Capital. And there, Marx is interested in the double-sidedness of the process. On the one hand, dispossession, but on the other side, integrally connected to it, the flip side of it, the constitution of a proletariat, the expansion of a proletariat, including the reserve army of labor. In my view, Marx didn't fully appreciate just how radical and powerful this argument was in his own text. And I think one of the reasons for that is that he developed in chapter 25 of Capital an account of what he called the capitalist law of population, which he believed would explain the internal generation of an industrial reserve army. And basically, Marx's argument goes like this. When capital mechanizes, it displaces labor. In so doing, it regularly constitutes and reconstitutes a reserve army of labor. Now, that was a very, very good argument for the time. The problem is it assumes a given birth rate. It assumes that the proletariat will keep reproducing itself at the same birth rate as it was in the 19th century. And of course, one of the things we know, and to which Marx didn't pay any attention, is that working class women in Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere, as the 19th century wore on and as we turned into the 20th century, increasingly regulated their own reproduction and in so doing reduced family sizes. This aspect of women's control over their own fertility and reproduction is absent in Marx's account, in part because he tends to treat reproduction of human beings as a natural process. He's insufficiently social in understanding its social regulation, in this case by working class women. As I say, Marx's analysis fit the facts empirically of the time. If you look at the century prior to the First World War, for instance, 50 million people left Europe. And so the idea that huge numbers were being displaced, that there was emigration, not net immigration into Europe, was historically accurate. But as family size for the working class in Europe declines, what we've seen is that the countries at the core of the global capitalist system have become net importers of labor, not net exporters. So much so, in fact, that there would be dramatic drops in the size of the population, therefore in the size of the working class, and therefore the drying up of the Industrial Reserve Army if they were reliant purely on internal mechanisms of displacement. Interestingly, Marx maybe intuits some of this because the last sections of his chapter 25 talk about both the British agricultural proletariat and most significantly about Ireland. And in that section, all of a sudden Marx expands the horizon of his analysis of British capitalism to think about one of its colonial possessions, Ireland, and the flow of surplus labor from Ireland into Britain as a key part of constituting and reconstituting the working class. And really what I want to suggest, and I'll give a little bit of empirical underpinnings to this, is that insight that Marx has at the end about Britain's relationship to Ireland and the key role of Irish workers in replenishing the Industrial Reserve Army can serve as a paradigm for thinking about primitive accumulation, austerity, displacement, and the reconstitution of the labor market, the working class in the countries of the core. And to give you some sense of how significant these problems are, the UN Population Fund estimates that by 2050, the population of Europe will contract by 125 million without immigration. This is a massive contraction that we're talking about in something under 40 years, to see your population decline by 125 million. Even in cases where birth rates and family sizes are significantly higher, like Canada and the United States, the reliance on immigration is still huge. Take, for instance, the growth of the US population between 2000 and 2010. It was more than half reliant on immigration from Latin America. And without that immigration from Latin America, the Industrial Reserve Army and what those economists that Michael Perelman was talking about like to call the natural rate of unemployment, brackets, the natural rate of unemployment simply means the level of unemployment that allows capital to hold down wages. okay? And now there's a debate. For a long period of time, the natural rate was considered to be 4%, and that was enough to have a depressive impact on wage growth. Now some economists are saying maybe 6% looks better. Well, of course, once again, we're not dealing with a natural law. We're dealing with a social construction that represents social power, where capital recognizes what level of unemployment it needs to effective accumulation. But the point is, in all of the global north today, without ongoing processes of importing workers who are effectively displaced elsewhere, the natural rate of unemployment, as they like to call it, or what Marx calls the industrial reserve army, would not be sufficient for capital's needs. And this, I suggest, is really the key to thinking through some of what is going on, both in the neoliberal era, but also, of course, particularly with austerity right now. And by the way, I won't be able to get into this in any detail, but in my book, Global Slump, that PM Press has over in the corner, I try to argue that there were several pillars of a neoliberal economic expansion across the 1980s and 90s. And here I dissent from some left economists who believe we've been in a crisis for 40 years. I don't think global capitalism was in a crisis in the 80s and 90s. I think it entered one in 2008, but I don't think there was 4 decades of crisis. And one of the reasons for the restoration of dynamism within capitalism across the neoliberal era was precisely this process of enormous growth in the global reserve army of labor. Obviously, our figures here are pretty much ballpark figures, but if we look at the period since the early 1980s, the best estimates we have is that the global proletariat, that is to say, those who have no other means of reproducing themselves except to sell their labor power, that group globally grew from about 1.5 billion to something a little over 3 billion. In other words, it more than doubled across the neoliberal era. And today, the global reserve army represents about 50% of those 3.25 or so billion people. And what that means, remember from Marx, the global reserve army consists of those who are fully unemployed or those whose employment is extremely precarious. And this would, of course, include millions and millions of people in the so-called informal sector in both the global south and the global north. Now, with respect to cheap labor, there are really 2 options for capital. Capital can go where labor is cheap, and of course, the very significant growth of foreign direct investment in China, for instance, over the last 30 years, is part of that process of capital going where labor is cheap. But similarly, capital can bring cheap labor to where its work processes are relatively fixed. In other words, those capitalist processes which are highly fixed spatially, agriculture, you can't pick up and move the land, construction, work in a whole variety of service industries, hotels, restaurants, and so on in major cities like this, New York. These are places where capital will try to establish mechanisms then for moving cheap labor into these centers of accumulation. And so we see both processes. Some analyses, I think, tend not to see how they form a unity, that capital can both move and capital can also bring labor to it. But this is all the process of what we might describe as the globalization of the labor market. We still have a tendency in a lot of our commentary to treat labor markets as if they're purely national constructions. Whereas in fact, one of the things which is clear about the so-called globalization era is just the increasing integration of flows of labor across national borders. And of course, for the North American economy, Mexico remains an absolute key to the global reserve army. I mean, it's no accident that Mexico comes 3rd in the world in terms of the export of labor, the migration of labor across borders, First comes China, then comes India, then comes Mexico. And I don't think I need to tell you there's a big population jump as you move down. But of course, it's got to do with how strategically central Mexican labor and other Latin American labor is to accumulation in North America. In the neoliberal era, I'll suggest, and particularly today in the age of austerity, displaced migrant labor constitutes the ideal precarious worker. In other words, we all know that precariousness, increased insecurity, has become central, crucial, definitional of the neoliberal austerity regime. You make labor more insecure, and there are a whole series of ways of doing that, from busting unions to creating new legal frameworks which make union recognition and strikes more difficult, to actually creating pools of labor that do not have the full set of formal legal political rights that citizen labor has. And of course, this is why we see the paradox particularly sharp in the United States, where the economy becomes increasingly reliant on these flows of labor, and at the same time, these flows of labor across borders are subjected to ever more repressive and draconian systems of regulation and surveillance, militarized systems of surveillance and regulation. And many of you will know better than I do that the current immigration bill working its way through Congress is going to require an ever greater militarization of the Mexican-US border as part of creating a path to citizenship for many undocumented workers in the United States. These two sides of the coin are in a dialectical contradiction, not a logical one. And by that what I mean is that it is not a contradiction for capital to say it wants to militarily police migrant labor, and at the same time it wants to admit it. Because of course what you then do is you admit millions of people into the labor market who lack full legal rights and protections, who are essentially more insecure, more precarious, more unprotected than anyone else. And you can do this either through legal programs or through simply having an acceptance and a tolerance of the economic necessity of undocumented migrant labor. In the Canadian case, with which I'm quite familiar, there is now a program called the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. The number of workers admitted under this program has tripled in the last decade, and these workers are legally deprived. They come in with papers which strip them of all kinds of legal and political rights and allow Canadian employers to pay them 15% less than the wage that they can document for them. So here you're getting precarious labor that's actually nicely documented at the border, but it serves the same function as undocumented labor in France or the United States or what have you. This, by the way, and I won't be able to go into this in any detail, on the other side creates whole new structures by which labor and labor power is being reproduced in those economies which are exporting labor. It creates whole new structures of family and gender relations, the emergence of what some socialist feminist commentators have referred to as transnational motherhood, where women are on the move, sending remittances across borders, and so on. So it's very significant transformations in gender forms, but of course also it is crucial to what is also referred to today as neo-racism. That is to say, the ways in which the migrant worker has become the key target for a whole series of neo-racist parties and practices, very, very widespread in Europe at the moment, whether you're talking about the Golden Dawn Party in Greece or the UK Independence Party in Britain, but of course has also been a Tea Party phenomenon in the United States. Now, I'm running out of time, so I really just want to conclude by way of saying that migrant workers have also been in the forefront of a whole series of highly innovative forms of resistance in recent years. And it's extremely important that in developing practices of working class solidarity with respect to migrant workers, the left doesn't depict migrant workers simply as victims. In fact, from the struggles of the sans-papiers in France, occupying buildings, carrying on demonstrations, winning legalization for thousands and thousands of undocumented workers, to strikes in Italy of migrant workers in recent months and so on, and of course to the migrant and immigrant justice struggles in the United States. Migrant workers have shown their capacity to self-organize, to sometimes play very, very important roles in working class and anti-racist movements. And it seems to me that one of the things we need to pay attention to is that if, as I'm suggesting, the constitution of the global reserve army of labor has become more central to the operations of late capitalism in the age of austerity, then organizing for migrant justice and anti-racist working class politics becomes not just something to recognize on May Day, but needs to become really integral and central to all politics of working class resistance today. Thank you.